Today, we're going to dig into one of the most foundational stories ever told, Adam, Eve, and the Garden of Eden. But we're going to be looking at it through a completely different lens, one that comes from an allegorical interpretation in a text called The Goal of the Wise.
So let's just jump right in with a question that's going to flip this whole story on its head. Ready? What if that forbidden tree wasn't a tree at all? I mean, really think about that. This one question is basically the key to unlocking everything we're about to get into.
Okay, so before we can get to the sin, we got to understand the setup, right? The rules of the game. So the source we're looking at says God makes this covenant with Adam. He basically says, you're my successor, you're in charge, and almost everything in the entire Garden of Eden was fair game. Everything was allowed, except for just one thing, one single rule.
And yeah, you guessed it, that one rule had to do with the tree. You know the one. In the Quran, it's called the tree of immortality. In the Bible, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But whatever you call it, this was the one off-limits thing in a world where everything else was a yes.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Check out this quote from Imam al-Ridha. He says, "It is not like the trees of the world." Now that's a huge clue, right? It's like he's telling us, hey, don't take this literally. So if it's not like any tree we know, then what on earth was it?
And boom, here it is, the big reveal. According to this interpretation, the tree was never a tree. Not with bark, not with leaves, none of that. It was an allegory, a symbol for a specific group of people, the Prophet Muhammad and his family. So the rule wasn't about not eating an apple. No, it was about something way, way deeper.
So, that changes everything, doesn't it? If the sin wasn't about munching on a piece of forbidden fruit, then what was it? What did Adam actually do wrong?
Well, this is where we get to the core of it. The source says it wasn't just simple disobedience, like a kid sneaking a cookie. It wasn't about hunger or even curiosity. It was about something so much more relatable, so much more human. It was about envy, about wanting a rank, a status that just wasn't his.
And this passage from the source just lays it all out. Adam, feeling pretty good about himself after being honored by God, he sees the names of Muhammad and his family up on God's throne, and he thinks to himself, did God ever create anyone better than me? And God's response is basically a direct warning shot. Yeah, I did. They're your descendants, and they are better than you. So do not ever look at them with the eye of envy.
So let's be super clear. That's the sin. It's envy. He wanted what they had, their spiritual rank. The very act of looking at them with the eye of envy was him approaching the allegorical tree. And just like that, covenant broken.
And what's wild is, this idea of the tree being a person isn't totally out of left field. The source actually points to parallels, like in the Gnostic Gospel on the Origin of the World. In that story, this divine woman, Zoe, who's also Eve, literally turns into the tree of knowledge to hide from some bad guys. So again, you have this idea that the tree is actually a living, divine being.
And the consequences? Oh, they were fast and they were harsh. Adam, Eve, and the one who tempted them, Azazel or Satan, they were all kicked out of the garden, banished to earth and told they'd now be enemies. Just like that, paradise was gone.
But, believe it or not, getting exiled isn't even the craziest part of the story. What this source claims happens next, down on Earth, well, it's probably the most shocking part of this whole thing.
Okay, so the source brings up this really fascinating verse from the Quran. God is talking to Satan after the fall, and he says, "And mutually share with them in wealth and children." Now that phrase has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries, but the text we're looking at, it takes that verse very, very literally. So let's just stop for a second. What could that possibly mean? For Satan to share in humanity's children? Is that just a metaphor for, being a bad influence? Or could it be something else, something biological?
And here is the absolute bombshell. The source claims that Cain is the biological son of Iblis, or Satan, not Adam. That after the exile, Satan approached Eve, and their union resulted in Cain.
And just like before, this idea isn't totally in a vacuum. The source points to the Legends of the Jews, which tells a startlingly similar story. It talks about Cain being the son of the angel Samael, which is another name for Satan. And it even has Eve saying at his birth, "I have gotten a man through an angel of the Lord."
So this whole idea of an alternate lineage, it sets the stage perfectly for the next massive turning point for humanity, the very first murder. And this one act of violence is going to expose a huge flaw in that original simple covenant and change the rules of the game forever.
And then it happens. Cain murders his brother Abel. It's the first murder. I mean, think about that. It's a crime that has literally never happened before in all of history. It's completely unprecedented.
So that creates a huge legal problem, right? How do you punish a crime when there's no law against it yet? What's the penalty for something that's never, ever happened before? Let's just look at the difference here. You have the Adamic law, which was super simple, just one rule about the tree, no mention of murder. Then you have later religious laws, which are full of complex legal codes, and you better believe they have a penalty for murder, usually death. Cain, he was living under that first, really simple system.
And that's why Cain wasn't executed. According to this view, he couldn't be. He hadn't actually broken a written law. And this whole terrible event showed that the simple one-rule covenant, well, it just wasn't going to cut it anymore for a humanity that was now capable of violence. The law itself had to change. It had to evolve.
And the source really brings this all home with a quote from the book of John. It's where Jesus is talking to his opponents, and he says, flat out, "You belong to your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning." Whoa. I mean, that just perfectly reinforces this whole idea of two different bloodlines, two different lineages, in conflict right from the start.
All right, so let's do a super quick recap of these bombshells. 1. The forbidden tree? Not a tree, it was an allegory for people. 2. The original sin? Not just disobedience, it was envy. 3. The source claims Cain was literally the son of Satan. And 4. Divine law isn't set in stone, it had to evolve because of what we humans did.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. This whole interpretation reframes our origin story. It's not just a simple story about right and wrong, it's about the very beginning of law. So if even divine law has to change and adapt to human behavior, what does our very first story say about our last?